the chapter. And we talked about the nephron, which is and we'll get into it more in lecture, but how the nephron is the functional kind of filtering unit, right, of the kidney. And basically, the job of the kidneys are going to be to filter blood, okay? So we're now going to explain how the blood comes pretty much from the descending abdominal aorta into the kidney and then how it leaves the kidney, okay? So we're going to start off with the blood flow off of the descending abdominal aorta, all right? So you have a right and left renal artery, all right? So that will branch off into what we call the segmental arteries, and it can be anywhere from 3 to 5 segmental arteries for the kidney. Now, keep in mind, we're going to come back to the segmental, I don't want to say the arteries, but there's actually a debate about segmental veins, and I'll get into that in a second here. All right. So the renal artery branches off into the segmental arteries. Then the segmental arteries will branch off into what we call the interlobular arteries. And remember what a lobe of the kidney was? We had this. Well, actually, let me go up to this one here. There we go. Okay. Here is a lobe, in case you're wondering, of a kidney here. All right. The renal lobe includes, all right, the renal pyramid here, and then parts of the adjacent, all right, renal columns on either side. Okay. So that's what the interlobular arteries, all right, are going to supply. All right. Those regions there. Okay. And so what we'll see is that these arteries will travel up to where the cortex of the kidney and the medulla portion of the kidney, all right, they call that the cortical medullary junction there, all right? And what will happen is those arteries will take a 90-degree turn, and they'll form what we call the arcuate arteries. And these arcuate arteries, all right, are going to run along the cortical medullary junction. All right, so they'll basically be along the base of the renal pyramid. So here, this is a renal pyramid right here. All right, we have the base here, the apex here, all right, which is going to be the renal papillae. And so these arcuate arteries will run along the base here. And then finally, off the arcuate arteries, we'll have the interlobular arteries. So they'll take another almost 90-degree turn and go up into the cortex here. And then from there, we'll have the afferent arteries coming off, going into the glomerulus, and then the efferent will come out of that. We'll go through that. And so the venous drainage of this is pretty much the opposite. Right, easy for me to say. And we'll talk about that in a second. Let me show you just a couple structures here. Okay. So looking here, all right, on the renal pyramid here, you can see at the base, or excuse me, this is the base, this is the apex, which is the papillae. All right, this is where we're going to have the urine draining into the minor calyces down here. All right, so what we'll see, all right, we have our intralobular artery coming up this way, and then it branches and it forms our arcuate artery. Okay, and the arcuate artery, this is the renal cortex here, and this is the medulla here. So it's right there at the cortical medullary junction here. So the arcuate artery will then give off a branch that will go into the cortex. We call that the interlobular artery, or you can also call it the cortical radiate artery. And then off of the interlobular artery, you'll have the little afferent arteriole that goes into the glomerulus here. And then on the other side, you can't see it in this one, you can see it here, we have the efferent arteriole coming out. All right, then obviously if there's a vein with it, we usually call the vein, all right, the same name that we gave the artery here. So this is the arcuate artery. All right, over here you'll see the interlobular vein, all right, or the cortical radiate vein. I'll show you over here a little bit better. We'll zoom in. Okay. So here you can see the arcuate artery coming in, all right, and it gives off, all right, the interlobular artery. Here's the afferent arteriole going into the renal corpuscle, and then the smaller arteriole coming off is going to be the efferent arteriole. And then you can see here, it's not on this side, but if we kind of jump over this side, you can see here where we have the venous drainage from. All right, we'll talk about what the structure. We talked about it, not the vasa recta, but the peritubular capillaries are over here. All right, we'll get into that in a second. So you can see here, all right, the balls, these yellow balls, that's going to be the renal corpuscle. And the renal corpuscle is made up of two structures: the glomerulus, which is the capillary bed on the inside, and then the capsule that surrounds the glomerulus, all right, known as the glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule. All right, and there's a space there, okay, and that's where the filtrate is going to start to form. All right, and then get drained off here, all right, into the proximal convoluted tubule. What else did I miss? All right, arcuate artery, arcuate vein. All right, couple more structures here. All right, here's the proximal convoluted tubule coming off of the renal corpuscle. All right, then it drains down here, all right, into the loop of Henle. Okay, and then the loop of Henle comes back up from the medulla back into the cortex. Then we have our distal convoluted tubule here. All right, and then the distal convoluted tubule will then drain into the collecting duct. But at the very end of the distal convoluted tubule, all right, we're going to have our collecting tubule, just that small portion there. But here's where we're going to start to form the urine. Okay, so here you can see that nice afferent arteriole coming off of the interlobular artery going into the renal corpuscle, and then the smaller arteriole exiting out of the renal corpuscle. All right, and that's the efferent arteriole. And here's our capillary network where we're going to start to see that mixing of blood. All right, and that is going to be the peritubular capillaries. And then down here we'll have the same thing around the loop of Henle, and that's called the vasa recta. All right, so like I said, this bunch of capillaries here is superimposed over this area here. All right, we're just showing you one without the other. All right, but this capillary bed, all right, sits over all of these tubes here. Hence the name peritubular, all right, capillaries. All right, so I'm going to show you something on here on this next slide. I'm somewhat hesitant, especially when we get into this area here. So I'm gonna do what we call CYA, cover my rear end. Okay, and so I've looked up, gone on the internet, looked in several different resources about the segmental vein. Okay, but the fact of the matter is the school gave me this. All right, so I'm going to have it labeled as such, but I'm going to tell you. I'll talk to you about this in a second. All right, without further ado. Okay, so you have your renal artery. Okay, enters into, all right, the kidney, and it gives off a bunch of branches. All right, those first group of branches are called segmental arteries. You have one going here. Here's another one. Here's another one. Those are segmental arteries. Okay, those segmental arteries will then head up, all right, in between, all right, the renal pyramids. When they're in between the renal pyramids, all right, those are the interlobular arteries. All right, and then they take like a 90-degree turn and run along the base of the renal pyramids, and that's known as the arcuate artery. And then they'll fan out and head up towards the cortex, all right, and then that is known as the interlobular artery or the cortical radiate artery. Okay, you can see they're all through here. All right, and it's off of those interlobular arteries that we have our afferent arteriole that goes into the glomerulus there. Okay, so when you're looking at this, when we go into the venous drainage, it's in the opposite direction, obviously, okay? So up here, where you see the vein here, the blue structure, all right, that's going to be the interlobular vein or the cortical radiate vein, which drains into the arcuate vein. All right, and then the arcuate vein will drain into the interlobular vein. All right, now, when I get here, again, this model says segmental vein. All right, but I've seen several resources that there are no segmental veins. Okay, so if this was on a test and you were to label it segmental vein, I wouldn't mark you wrong. Okay, but all right, from what I've researched, all right, in the nomenclature for anatomy, I guess the organization that's in charge of naming things, all right, they refuse to acknowledge that as the segmental vein, so it is referred to as the interlobular vein. All right, then that drains into the renal vein. All right, even your book has that, and I'll show it to you in a second. They don't mention the segmental vein, but I don't know why it's labeled like that. And so it confused me, so I went and researched it. Which is what you should do. When you're not sure, go out there and look things up. All right, so the afferent arteriole is going to enter into the renal corpuscle, forming the glomerulus. All right, that's where we're going to get our blood plasma filtered. And it forms that filtrate. That's what it's called. All right. So then what exits out of the renal corpuscle, all right, is going to be the efferent arteriole. All right, and that's going to branch over to the peritubular capillaries or the vasa recta. All right, the peritubular capillaries. So you have a choice when you're the efferent arteriole. All right, it can send branches to the peritubular capillaries, which are going to go all over the proximal convoluted tubule, the distal convoluted tubule, that capillary bed, or it can go down to the vasa recta capillary bed, which is that capillary bed that covers the loop of Henle. Okay. All right, so peritubular capillaries are going to be around the tubular portion or tubular network of our nephron. So that is going to be around the proximal and distal convoluted tubules. All right, we'll see this mainly in the cortex of the kidney. All right, the vasa recta is going to be along the loop of Henle, the nephron loop there. All right, and we'll see that in the medulla of the kidney. All right, so basically the blood has to go through one of those two capillary beds, either the peritubular capillary bed or the vasa recta. All right. And then finally, it's going to drain into the venous system there. All right, so here we're looking here at the venous system. All right, starting off in the cortex here, we got the interlobular veins. All right, and that's going to be just after those capillary beds that I was talking about. That blood will drain into, so if we're coming down from the cortex, that will drain into the arcuate vein. Right, which runs along the base of the renal medulla there, the renal pyramid. And then in between those renal pyramids, it dips down and forms the interlobular veins, and which will head all the way and travel and drain into the renal vein. All right, notice, all right, there's no segmental vein. I don't know why I keep harping on that, but it just bothers me that it's labeled like that. All right, so let me show you a good picture from the book here about that. All right, so blood flowing into, and I love how this picture has everything labeled here, all right? So blood flows into the renal artery, it branches off into the segmental arteries, all right, which will then start to travel through the medulla in between the renal pyramids, all right, and that's going to be your interlobular arteries. Then they turn and run parallel to the base of those pyramids, and that's the arcuate artery, and then they take a turn up towards the cortex here, and they are then known as the interlobular arteries, which then branch off. All right, they have the afferent arteriole, which goes into the glomerulus. All right, blood plasma gets filtered. All right, the arteriole that exits out of the glomerulus, all right, that is known as the efferent with an E, efferent arteriole. which has a choice. It can go, all right, follow the flow chart. It can either go to the peritubular capillaries up here, or it can go down here to the vasa recta. All right, and then on the other side of those capillary beds is the venous blood flow. So once, all right, on the other side, all right, the venous blood gets drained into, we'll go the opposite way, the interlobular or lobular vein, which then drains into the arcuate vein, which will then drain into the interlobular vein all the way into the renal vein. Questions? No? Okay. Let's talk about some filtrate then, briefly, okay? Because again, we know that our kidneys make urine, but before it becomes urine, we call it a couple other things, all right? And the first thing that we call it is going to be filtrate. This is what we call that filtered fluid, all right, that is in the glomerulus, all right? So that filtered fluid in the glomerulus is known as filtrate, all right? And so we're going to see, all right, a bunch of things are going to come out of the blood. All right. For example, if you're very hydrated, right, a lot of water will move across that membrane into the filtrate. Okay. So you'll increase your urinary output. All right. If you have a lot of solutes, all right, high amounts of sodium, high amounts of potassium, all right, stuff that your body doesn't need, you'll see, all right, accumulate here into the filtrate. Okay. So it's going to move across, all right, those glomerular capillaries into that Bowman space or that capsular space there. All right, and at that point, we call it filtrate. All right. After that, it gets a new name. Okay, so when that fluid moves into the proximal convoluted tubule, we call that tubular fluid. All right, and so it's going to run through all these structures. It's going to go from the proximal convoluted tubule and the nephron loop into the distal convoluted tubule. It'll enter into those collecting tubules before they eventually empty into the collecting ducts. Then in the collecting ducts, that's when we call that fluid urine. Okay, we'll start. That's pretty much what you are going to be getting rid of, all right, when you use the lavatory. All right, so just kind of be familiar with the names of this of the liquid, I guess I should say. All right, filtrate. When it's inside that glomerular space there, right, when it starts to run through the tubes, all right, we call it tubular fluid. Then when we're down into the collecting ducts, all right, pretty much as it's starting to leave the renal pyramids, it's now called urine. All right. So pretty much, all right, when we're in, all right, that collecting duct and it's exiting that fluid, when it's exiting the papillary duct, all right, we have now referred to it as urine. At the base, remember at the base of those pyramids there, all right, we have the renal papillae. There's all these little holes there. I'll show you a picture. It drains out, all right, that's where all those collecting ducts go. It drains out, and there's this little tube-like structure here at the base. That's our minor calyx, okay? And then when we have several minor calyces join up, all right, we form a major calyx. And then when all the major calyces come together, all right, near the hilum of the kidney, all right, that's the renal pelvis, all right, then that renal pelvis drains all of that urine into the ureter. And from there, all right, we know that the urine goes from the ureter down into the bladder, and then from the bladder into the urethra, and then out of your body, okay? So this picture, I like this picture here because it shows, I'll zoom in a little bit, all right, what we call that fluid here, all right, so it's in the capsular space, filtrate, called tubular fluid all through here, all through the tubular system here. All right, we get into the collecting duct here, all right, we're still getting stuff flowing down, but as we're getting into the base here of that collecting duct, as it's about to leave, all right, the renal medulla here, or excuse me, the renal pyramid, all right, into the renal papillae, all right, now we start to call it urine. And then from there, all right, that urine is going to drain into these minor calyces at the base of these renal pyramids into the papillae, and then it goes from the minor calyx to the major calyx to the renal pelvis, down into the ureter, into the bladder. That whole time, it's referred to as urine. Speaking of the bladder, let's talk about it. Does anyone remember what type of epithelium lines the urinary bladder? Transitional, yeah, that's the transformer epithelium. It changes shape depending on how full or how empty the bladder is. Okay, so the bladder's job is to store and hold on to urine before it gets excreted out of the body. Okay, so all right, there's a couple layers here to the bladder. All right, the internal layer, all right, which is going to be where the urine is going to be. That's going to have that transitional epithelium with some lamina propria. Then below that, we'll have a muscularis a muscularis layer, which is going to be what we call the detrusor muscle. All right, the detrusor muscle is the muscle that will squeeze. It's smooth muscle that will squeeze the bladder as you're using the lavatory there. Then the outer layer is the adventitia here. So let's show you a quick picture here. Okay, so this whole structure, all right, is our urinary bladder. This is a male model because at the base of the urinary bladder is the prostate gland. All right, so on the inside of the bladder, you've got these small folds here, similar like how the stomach had the folds, the gastric folds. We call those rugae. These are urinary rugae. Okay, so obviously when the when the bladder is distended from a large volume of urine, okay, those folds will flatten out. Okay. Well, if you notice at the base here of the bladder, you have this triangular structure, and that's called the trigone of the bladder. And it's this smoothed area here, and it's demarcated by the top corners here, and here. This is where your ureters will enter into the bladder and empty urine into the bladder here. Okay, so you have a right and left opening here in the bladder that come from the right and left ureter. All right, and so from here to here, all right, and from each ureter down here to the opening to the urethra, it forms a triangle. So we call that the trigone of the bladder, and it's a smoothed out area there. So that opening that leaves the bladder, okay. We're going to talk about that. There's going to be a sphincter there. There's an internal sphincter and an external sphincter, similar to what we saw with the anus there. All right. The internal sphincter is under smooth muscle control, involuntary control, and then the external is going to be under skeletal muscle. That's going to be under voluntary control. All right. But when we're talking about the urethra for men, okay, we have three parts to our urethra. Okay, you have the prostatic urethra. That's the part of the urethra that runs through, all right, the prostate gland. And then you have what's called the membranous urethra. We'll talk about that in a second. That's the part of the urethra that goes through the floor, the pelvic floor, all right, the levator ani muscle. Then you have, all right, the spongy urethra, and that's the part that goes through the male penis. All right, we'll talk about that in a second, though. All right, so here you can see, all right, the different layers, all right, for the urinary bladder. The innermost layer, that's where the epithelium, that's the mucosal layer, all right, which is made up of the lamina propria, all right, right below it. And then we have our submucosa, right, that has connective tissue in it, all right, and then the muscularis, that's where our detrusor muscle is. That's that smooth muscle that helps to contract the bladder. And the outer layer is the adventitia. So you can look here on our microscope here. You can see that transitional epithelium that lines the rugae here. Okay. All right. So from a sagittal view or mid-sagittal view, you can see here. This model should look familiar. You saw it last semester. All right. Here's the urinary bladder. You see all the folds here. Okay. Prostatic or not prostatic. The rugae. And then at the base here of, or the bottom here of the urinary bladder is the opening, and that canal, all right, that goes through the prostate gland is the prostatic urethra, all right, and the shortest portion of the urethra that goes through the pelvic floor, the levator ani muscle, all right, that's the membranous urethra, and then the longest portion of the urethra in the male, all right, is the spongy or the penile urethra that kind of goes all the way here to the external environment there. Okay, so keep in mind, all right, We call the folds in the urinary bladder the same thing that we call the folds in the stomach, all right, rugae. All right, almost done. Let's talk about the urethra here, okay? Now, when we talk about the urethra, all right, all right, it is an epithelial tissue line structure. And in this case, all right, we're going to talk about how some of that epithelium kind of varies, and I'll get to that in a second here, all right? But understand that it basically is the pathway from the inside of the urinary bladder outside of the body, okay? And its job, well, I can't say it has one job, all right? In women, it has one job, all right? It's for the movement of urine only. In men, it's for the movement of urine and semen, okay? But we do have two sphincters here, okay? The internal, smooth muscle, and the external is going to be skeletal muscle. So that's the sphincter that you are going to learn how to control, all right, again, when you are learning to toilet train, okay? So smooth muscle means involuntary, okay? And this is right at the base of the bladder. So the bladder comes down here, the urethra leaves, and it's right here, all right? Autonomic nervous system, okay? Again, that is a spinal reflex, which means that reflex does not make it up to the cranium, okay? The external urethral sphincter, all right, is going to be the skeletal muscle, all right, the floor of the pelvis, all right, the levator ani muscles, all right, it's under voluntary control, all right, that means it's the somatic nervous system that is going to control the external urethra, or urethral sphincter, excuse me. All right, so I talked about female function, all right, one single function, transport of urine, lined by stratified squamous epithelium, okay? Male urethra, all right, function, passage of urine and semen, all right, but we have three segments, and so the histology is going to vary in the male urethra compared to the female urethra. It's nice and easy for the female urethra, just got to memorize the stratified squamous epithelium. Male urethra, we're going to see some transitional epithelium. We're going to see some different types of epithelium, all right? So the three segments, prostatic, membranous, spongy, or penile. Okay, let's start off in males here with the first part of the urethra, the prostatic urethra, okay? Here, all right, the urethra in males, because it has a dual function, all right, one for the passage of urine and two for the transmission of semen, all right, we're going to see that the prostatic urethra is going to be able to dilate to accommodate those varying structures, especially with semen, all right? But you'll notice that the prostatic urethra is lined by transitional epithelium. Okay, this is the first time we've seen transitional epithelium outside, all right, of the urinary bladder. We've talked about it mainly because of the bladder, but we'll see it only here in the prostatic urethra in males, all right? Also, we have these small ducts, these little tiny holes throughout, all right, for that seminal fluid that the prostate gland secretes, all right, will get admitted into, all right, it'll get admitted into that part of the urethra, all right, to add some fluids to the ejaculate here, okay? All right, the next part of the urethra, this is the smallest part, and this is the part that pierces through the pelvic floor there, the levator ani muscle, all right? So this is the membranous urethra, all right? It has muscle fibers that are surrounded specifically skeletal muscles. And so this is where we're going to see, all right, where that external urethral sphincter is going to be located there, all right? And then finally, the largest part and the most distal portion of the urethra is the spongy urethra, all right? And this part of the urethra is going to travel through erectile tissue in the penis. Basically what that is the cavernosus type of tissue that during the male erection becomes engorged with blood, all right? We refer to that as the corpus spongiosum here, all right? then that takes you all the way to the exit of the urethra, the external urethral orifice there. So here you can see, for the female portion of this, it's a little bit easier. Just two structures that you have to know. All right, the bladder and the urethra. Easy, right? Okay, a couple things, and I know I don't have to say this to you ladies, all right, but sometimes I have to say it to some of my male students. No offense to any of the male students that are listening. When you're looking at a model, look at it and see if it's a male or female model. And I'm really being serious when I say this, because sometimes when people are in a rush, their mind goes to other places and they're not focusing on things, all right? A couple of things that tell us that this is a female model is, one, the presence of the uterus and the ovaries will help, and the absence of external genitalia. All right, so that will tell you then that for any possible answer choice on this slide here, I can't put membranous urethra, I can't put prostatic urethra, or spongy or penile urethra. Should not exist. All right, so my point being is just kind of, I need to remind people of this, because you'd be surprised, and I hate to say it, but even some of my female students will mess it up. All right, I hate to say it, but I got to be honest with y'all. All right, so you can see here again from this figure from the book. All right, when we're looking here at the female urethra, here you've got the urinary trigone here. All right, it drains down here. Our first sphincter is the internal urethral sphincter. That's smooth muscle. All right, and then our external urethral sphincter is going to be in the floor. All right, that pelvic diaphragm flooring there, or the levator ani muscle, all right, right in through here. All right, so that's where we're going to have the external urethral sphincter. Okay, so female is a little bit easier than male. All right, male, we're just adding a few things here. Okay, same scenario. We've got the internal urethral sphincter here at the base of the bladder. All right, then the urethra passes through here, through the prostate gland. That's the prostatic urethra. Then we hit the pelvic floor here. All right, and then that's when we'll have our membranous urethra. In addition, we'll also have the external, all right, urethral sphincter here. All right, that's under skeletal muscle control. And then we have the distal part, and the longest part there is the spongy urethra. All right, any questions about anything? Not too bad. All right, so do me a favor. Right, because normally I was planning doing the metabolism here, but I told you I would make the recording for you, so I have a little bit of work for me. Unless you guys want to stay. You guys want to stay? What? Come on. All right. Okay. All right. But then by leaving, you're promising me that you will watch the video, all right, between now and the next time we meet on the Monday after, so a week from Monday.
That's about all I got to do, right?
Okay. Watch my videos? That's cool. All right.